Amen. You know, it's clear that God has his hands in even a worship service where I'm preaching to an empty room because, you know, this week it's been kind of crazy. We didn't coordinate songs, but I feel like Bailey and Ben have chosen a song that just kind of seamlessly rolls right into this morning's message. It's a proclamation of the faithfulness of God in our life in previous generation after generation after generation. And so thank you guys very much for leading us in worship. If you're watching online, my name is Andy. I'm the pastor of student ministries here at Bridge Community Church. And I wanted to point a couple things out. I think if I step aside, you can see this sign. These are our values. And I was thinking that especially these values of authenticity and transparency make perfect sense, because I'm going to venture to guess that somebody is sitting in their underwear right now eating a giant bowl of cereal. And, you know, when we stand up here and we say things like, you can come as you are and all are welcome, that includes online. So if that's you, no shame, but please don't post anything online and tag us in it. We hate to be associated with that kind of behavior. Anyways, what an awesome opportunity that we have. You know, we were gathering before the service to pray, just a few of us, and we pointed out that online we're actually reaching more people than a Sunday morning here in the sanctuary. And you know what? That is a silver lining. Of course we want to be here and we want to be together. One of the things I just learned sitting here during worship is my voice is very, very bad. But it gets drowned out when we're all together, and so I miss that. And as I was preparing, I realized that there's some things about our community that I miss. I miss Toby giving me a hard time when I come through the lobby. I miss certain smiling faces. I miss Wanda's hugs, and I miss seeing people at the walkway, Linda and Jill Axtell. I miss all that. I miss our students. And so in the midst of all of that, I think on one hand we're struggling with all the things that we're losing, but I want to turn our attention to who God is. You know, this past couple weeks, I think my experience is similar to yours. On the one hand, we're consuming all this media, we're logging on our phones, and we're seeing updates about coronavirus and the response to it. We're seeing that there's all full-out panic. There's people who are buying into this myth that we have scarcity, and so they've hogged up 5,000 toilet paper rolls for 2 people. We've seen people point fingers and blame one another for whose fault it is and who has the better response. You know, I've seen this behavior that's a little alarming to me, and it's who can find a credible source that wrote an article or posted a video of some kind so that I can just confirm my opinion instead of listening to others. And so on one hand, I'm holding all of those things like many of you are. And on the other hand, this week, I'm trying my darndest to hold on to what Pastor Danny left us with last Sunday. See, last Sunday, at the end of his sermon, The Way of the Cross, he talked to us about how important it is to limit ourselves being overwhelmed by all of these things, and instead to fill ourselves with reminders and encouragements of the character and nature of God. And as I began to reflect and think on that a little bit, I was reading this week in the book of 1 Corinthians. If you're already anticipating where we're going, you could open your Bible to 1 Corinthians and just be prepared. But I was thinking that in this time of coronavirus, I've been hearing certain phrases and thoughts repeated over and over, like many of you have. I've heard the phrase, we are living in unprecedented times. I've heard it over and over and over. I've heard the phrase that this is a once-in-a-lifetime type of thing. I've heard that the response to all the things happening around us is foolish or dumb or ridiculous. And I was reading this week in the book of 1 Corinthians, and I realized that this is not new territory for the God that we worship. So we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 today, and before we full-blown dive in, I want to give us a little background like I often do. You see, Corinth, this city that the Apostle Paul is writing a letter to, I would argue that more than any other city in the entire Bible, Corinth is like Orange County. Corinth is a place where all the major trade routes in the ancient world, they all converge into one place, and it creates this booming metropolis of a city that's made up of different cultures and languages, different people groups from all over the known world. It's a place where trade happens. There's an ancient document that said if you want the best food in the ancient world, Corinth is your place. They had every ingredient known to man passing through Corinth. It was a place of different philosophies and religious beliefs. There was pagan gods. There were Jewish temples. There were booming churches that were beginning to sprout up. And this is where Paul's letter comes in, because Paul is writing this letter that we know as 1 Corinthians. He's writing it to a group of people who are asking this big question. I think it's one that we're asking ourselves. How do we faithfully follow Jesus? How do we embody the things that he taught us and hold firmly to the faith that we have in the midst of this very challenging, difficult place to live, where there's competing philosophies and ideas that are constantly pushing in on us? And so Paul pens this letter to encourage those people. Now, one last thing before we get right in here is that Paul is not just a normal guy. You know, sometimes we open our Bible and we just start reading and we forget to ask ourselves, who are these people? It turns out that Paul basically went to the Harvard of Judaism. He studied under a guy named Gamaliel. And so Paul has the Old Testament basically committed to memory. He probably has it like written on the back of his hand, like 14-year-old pre-Christian Andy cheating on a test. He's got it all written there, and he knows it all by heart. And when Paul writes 1 Corinthians, he has the Old Testament stories right on the forefront of his mind, and I think we're going to see some of that come through. So if you are following along at home, I would encourage you to open a Bible still if you have one. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we're going to begin at verse 18. Verse 18 says this, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." So this is what Paul is saying. Paul is saying to people who are having one heck of a time trying to figure out, how do I hold firm to the faith that I proclaimed in Jesus? Maybe I had this wonderful experience and I came to faith, but now I'm living in this very challenging, difficult world called Corinth. This is what Paul's first encouragement to them is. It's that the cross is not going to make sense to other people. People who don't have faith in Jesus Christ, don't be surprised if they don't get it. In fact, don't be surprised if they call it foolish. It's only by faith in Jesus that we come to his conclusion that the cross is the power of God to us who are being saved. Verse 19 goes on and says this. It says, "For it is written," this is Paul quoting the prophet Isaiah, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. The intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate." Paul is quoting a particular chunk of Scripture, and like I said, Paul knows his Old Testament inside and out. He didn't just reach into the Old Testament and think, I'm looking for a verse that might make sense to just kind of slap down and encourage the Corinthians. He picked a very particular passage of Scripture, so let me kind of bring it to life for you. Isaiah 29 comes at a time where the Israelites, the people of God, they've come together as a nation and they have begun to organize themselves politically. And this is what they do. They look around and they realize there are some very particular people as our neighbors. To the northeast, we have this group of people who are becoming a superpower. Their name is Assyria. And at this time, Assyria is basically a black hole sucking in every resource. They are conquering every people group they can find. Their military is getting boosted, and they are just moving out like locusts on a field. They are just dominating everyone around them. To the southwest, Israel's neighbors are Egypt, another very powerful empire of a people. And so Isaiah writes this passage, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate," at a point in time where the Israelite people, they decide that the Assyrians might just attack them and destroy them, and so they go to try to make an alliance with the Egyptians. And as they go and they try to make an alliance with the Egyptians, the Assyrians find out, and guess what happens? They preemptively attack, they destroy the Israelites, and they take them captive. And so this is what Paul is saying to the Corinthian people. He's telling them, Do not depend on the wisdom and the intelligence of all the people around you without consulting God. If you choose to make brash, quick decisions based on what wise, intelligent people are saying, and you refuse to listen to what God is saying, let me call to mind what happened to the prophet Isaiah when the Assyrians came and took them over. Paul continues in verse 20 when he says this, "Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age?" All rhetorical questions. Paul is basically asking them, stand before me and let's have this dialogue. Has God not made foolish the wisdom of the world? If you're taking notes at home, you can make note of the fact that this is in the past tense, that God has already made foolish the wisdom of the world. We're gonna see that in a second. For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Paul is making the exact same argument, and he's doing it a second convincing way. He's trying to tell these people, look, you cannot, through human philosophy and theology and wisdom and getting the right people in the right room, you're not going to have a conversation where the end result is you just land on God. The only way you're going to land there is by the gift of faith that God has given to you and fanned into flame. He's telling them, hold tightly to it. Even when people look at you and say, that is so dumb, that makes no sense, that's such an ancient way of believing. Or for the Jews, demand signs, it says. But Christ crucified is a stumbling block to Jews. Why is that? It's because Jews were anticipating that the Messiah would come. They had been told the Messiah would come in the line of David. They were expecting a warrior king with a sword. And so the idea that Christ was crucified is a stumbling block. It's a detail they can't get over and then they can't get past. Why? Because they don't have faith in Jesus. They're trying to get there by their thoughts alone. It's foolishness to Gentiles because Gentiles would say, why on earth would you ever put your faith in someone who gave himself over to be killed? Because Gentiles know that the way that you become powerful and authoritative is you exploit other people. You rise to the top. You slash a throat if you have to. This is how the ancient world worked. And Gentiles would hear this message, and they would say, just by human thought alone, it makes no sense. It's foolish. But for us, Paul writes, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. Verse 25, Paul finishes up this section. This is where we're going to kind of end this part of 1 Corinthians this morning. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Now I want to remind you of Paul's background. Paul the Apostle is one of the most intelligent people in the ancient world, not just the most intelligent person who wrote in the New Testament of the Bible, although he probably is that too. He's a guy who knows the history and the generations of what God has done. He knows Genesis. He knows Exodus. He knows it like it's on the back of his hand, like I've said. And so I want to call to mind in this season of coronavirus. Pastor Danny encouraged us last week to call to mind the character and the nature of God often. That would be the foundation that we're built on. When the winds blow, we realize our foundation is so strong. We are built on something. Whether coronavirus lasts another week, another month, whether it lasts 10 years, we are built on something that will not be shaken and will not be moved. And I believe this is what Paul is trying to tell the Corinthians. And I believe this is what Paul is trying to tell us this morning. So I was thinking, what kind of things did Paul have in mind when he wrote that the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength? I have to imagine that Paul was calling to mind one of the most famous stories in his people's history. It comes in Genesis 12 or 13, where God encounters this man. His name is Abram. And Abram is this older man, and he's been trying to have kids with his wife Sarah for ages, for decades. And God comes to Abram and tells him, Abram, you are going to be the father of a nation that I call my own. You are going to be the patriarch of the people who will reflect my glory everywhere they go. And Abram says, well, I believe you, God, because you're God, but I just want to remind you, I'm very old. Now, if you were just a bystander and you were looking into this story based on the wisdom of the world, this is what you would say. You would say that this story is dumb, that it makes no sense, that it's ridiculous, that whatever God came up with this kind of story doesn't know what he's doing. That if God wanted to start a people group of his own, he should probably start with some young 20s who are just passionately in love with each other, not a man and a woman in their hundreds. But in Genesis chapter 21, the promised son Isaac is born. And when Isaac is born, the promises of God come true, and God is faithful. And because of Abram's belief in God, his name changed to Abraham. Because of his faith in God, God brings glory through something that seems so foolish. I think this is what Paul had in mind when he wrote these words. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. I got to imagine that as Paul wrote those encouraging words to the Corinthians, he was thinking of this story. Maybe one of the most famous stories in the entire Bible. It comes in Exodus chapter 14. And it happens at a time when Paul's people, the Israelites, are enslaved in Egypt. Many of you know the story. And God basically flexes his God muscles and sends 10 plagues. And finally, Pharaoh calls Moses into his royal chambers and says, get your people together and get out. So Moses gathers the Israelites, the elderly and the newborn, the malnourished and the broken down. These people haven't been working out at the gym. These people have been laboring under the hot sun with very little to eat. They're moving slowly. And they're feeling like, finally, we are going to have relief. We're going to the promised land. And then they set up their camp on the seashore of the Red Sea. They look up and they see that Pharaoh has changed his mind. He wants his people back. He's been convinced that the economic pain of letting those people go is too great, and you need to go get them back. This is what wise, smart rulers do. So the Israelites look up and they see chariots and horses and swords and all sorts of weaponry coming their way. Now, if you were a bystander and you were just looking at a situation, you might kind of cross your arms and shrug and say, ooh, this is going to be ugly. I'm going to look away at what happens when these two groups of people meet. But God had different ideas. He told Moses to trust him, and Moses did. He had faith, and Moses, listening to God, raised his hands above the sea, and the sea split in two, and the people walked across on dry ground. I think Paul was thinking of this story when he wrote these words. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. I want to tell you two more stories. The next one comes from Joshua chapter 6, and kind of the backstory I want to tell you that I just love this story, and here's why. I became a Christian in my teenage years, and I remember feeling so insecure that I didn't know the Bible that I got my first Bible. It was like the cheapest paperback Bible. If you read the same page twice, it kind of just tore out. It was like the recycled paper, terrible ink Bible. But it was an NLT Bible, and I took it and I just started reading it. There was whole chunks of like Leviticus. I just said, I'm reading the whole thing, but I would just read words, and I'm like, I have no idea what this means. I'm committed. And I just read and read and read and read. And I remember coming to this story in Joshua chapter 6 and thinking, how on earth has nobody told me this one? This story is amazing. In Joshua chapter 6, Joshua has taken the baton from Moses to lead God's people. And finally, after wandering in the desert for 40 years, they finally get to enter the promised land. And they enter, and some terrible news comes their way very quickly. It's that they were anticipating the promised land being vacant, that they were just going to move in and it was going to be there. But here's the problem. There was already people living in the promised land, including a city called Jericho that was known as a violent city. It was known as having created the greatest fortress in the ancient world. Walls so thick that I read a commentary this week that just by physics and all the things that they can calculate, not even modern warfare could probably break through the walls very easily. And so they come into Jericho. Now, if you were a bystander and you were just watching this story unfold, you would probably say to yourself, we got to come up with some political tactic. Maybe we should cross the river and go back where we came. Maybe we should make an alliance with somebody with a stronger military. Or maybe we should think on a bigger scale. Maybe we should start choking out their resources to make them come out of this fortress they've built. But Joshua speaks to God, and God tells Joshua, trust me, have faith. And he does. And God tells Joshua, here's the plan. I want you to throw a worship concert for 7 days. For 6 days, I want you to walk around the city one time, shouting my praise. And on the 7th day, I want you to walk around 7 times. And when you reach the finish line, I want you to blow the ram's horn in celebration, and the walls will come down. Now, if you were just reading this story and you don't know how it ends, you would think this is the dumbest idea you've ever heard. How is singing praise going to do anything about rock walls? The two seem like they have nothing to do with each other. They're completely incompatible. But Joshua believes God, and they do. And when they cross the finish line after the 7th lap on the 7th day, they blow the ram's horn, the shofar, and the walls come tumbling down. I'd like to think that Paul had this story in mind when he said these words. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Now, until this point, I've been mostly speculating some of the stories Paul might have had in mind. I know Paul knew those stories, but I don't know that he 100% had those stories on his mind. But this last story, I know with absolute certainty that Paul had on his mind, because it's the story that he's writing to the Corinthian people about. It's the story that begins when sin enters the world and it begins to just break everything that God intended. It's the sin that begins to bleed and infiltrate every single nook and cranny, every corner of human existence. It ruins our ability to have a relationship with God. It wrecks our relationships with one another. It wrecks our relationship with ourselves. It ends in us exploiting what God created and taking what God intended for good and using it for personal gain. And the story goes like this, that God decided the time had come for him to enter the world and save it once and for all. And he did. He came the person of Jesus, not born into a divine household of Roman conquerors saying, I am God, I am Caesar. He wasn't born the first son of a military commander. He was born to a teenage girl in a boonies town in a barn. Now, I'm sure you know what I'm going to say already. That if you were looking in on this story is already a non-starter. This is the dumbest story you've ever heard of. Why on earth would the all-knowing, all-powerful God come into human existence this way? And if you're thinking, well, of course he would, I would say you are somebody who probably has faith, because that is the prerequisite, as Paul has already told us, to understand how all of these things fit together. So Jesus is born, and he lives a life, a perfect, sinless life. And he doesn't do it closed off in quarantine. He does it full access to people, showing mercy and forgiveness and grace and power and authority every step of the way. And he does it sinlessly. And then he takes upon himself the scorn and the mockery and the shame and all of the brokenness of human sin. He takes it on his own shoulders, and he takes it to a cross where he's nailed to it and he's killed. Now, if you were to enter the story and just see it at this point, you would think, ooh, it's a gruesome scene. I don't want to look at it, but it's sort of how I thought this story would end. Everybody who thought that this guy was the one clearly didn't know what they were talking about. But according to Paul and according to our Christian faith, that's not how the story ends, because 3 days later, Jesus, he's going to be attended by his disciples, and they show up and there's an empty tomb, and they find out that sin and brokenness and all that stuff is still in the tomb, but Jesus is not. He is risen back to life. I know with certainty that this is what Paul means when he writes these words. The foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. I want to wrap up this morning by just leaving a few thoughts with you. The first thought I have for you is this. We don't know how long quarantine is going to last. We don't know how long I'm going to have to be preaching to empty rooms, which is awkward, by the way. And I hope that I haven't put on 25 pounds on the camera. I think I'm looking okay in the monitor. But we just don't know. We don't know what's going to happen to people's jobs who are kind of walking a tightrope. We don't know if the world is going to go back to normal, when it's going to, or if it is. But I know with confidence that the things that the world looks at and in its wisdom say, this is unprecedented, this is foolish, this is once in a lifetime, all these decisions are stupid, they make no sense. I know with absolute certainty. I've read the entire book of stories that show us over and over and over that God has an enormous habit. It's almost like God can't help himself but bring himself glory in times when nobody thinks anything good is possible. My encouragement to you, as this is probably beginning to settle in, that it might be a little bit longer, that you would dwell on God's character and nature this week. That maybe you would begin to reflect, maybe write down, maybe talk around the dinner table, how have we seen God's faithfulness in times that just didn't make any sense? You know, I've heard stories this week of people saying, you know what? Our jobs are on the fritz, and I don't know how we're going to make money, but I remember that one time we were broke, and we didn't know how we were going to pay our bills, and somebody put an envelope of $500 cash in our mailbox. We still to this day have no idea who that was. Somebody told me that story this week. And they said, I know that God will come through. That is my encouragement to you, that you would tell those stories, that you would be reminded that we are living in an unprecedented time. We're living in a time that's once in a lifetime, but God has a habit of showing up in mighty ways. Wouldn't it be just like God that when we come back together, this place is even more full than it's ever been? Wouldn't it be just like God that more people's hearts would turn back to him, that maybe this would be a wake-up call, or maybe this would be a reminder of where their roots are planted? I want to remind you of that this week. Just one simple takeaway. Reflect often this week on the character and nature of God. I want to pray over you. If you're standing in front of the TV, that means you're probably fiddling with the dial and the color is off. But if you're seated, you can remain seated. I would just ask that you pray along remotely with me. God, thank you that everywhere we turn in your word, that we're reminded that you are in control. Thank you that that's great news for us at a time where so many people are grappling and battling for control, where we're trying to figure out what's right, what's wrong, which way is up and down, and we're thrown off kilter. We know that you're not. We know that you're the God that delivers in times of trouble. Would you remind us that those of us who have faith in you, we are built on a solid foundation that does not shift, it does not shake. Your word says even when the storm waters rise and beat up against the walls, we are built on a foundation that lasts. God, for those who are not in a place where they fully believe in you, I pray that this time of quarantine would be a time to reflect on the foolishness of what you've done. The foolishness that makes no sense to the world around us, but to those who believe it's your power, and we rest and we depend on that power this week. Amen.
Hi, Bridge Community Church. This is the Prizio family.
We just wanted to wish you well. We know this has been a really hard time, and we just wanted to let you know that we're praying for you, and that if there's anything anybody needs, that we are there for you. So we just look forward to the day that we'll be able to get back together and worship together, and oh, what a day that will be. So until then, know that you're prayed for, know that you're loved, and we're all in this together. Bye. Bye. Love you.
Hey, Bridge Community Church. It's Lisa Harris and Ron Harris and Matthew Harris. And we're just saying hi from the Harris home. We're all doing well, and we hope you are as well. And we miss you. Hope to see you soon.
Good morning, Bridge. How you doing today? I know these are difficult times, but you know what? How about a little humor? I didn't know that our awesome pastor is actually a prophet. Because if you think back about 6 months ago, when he talked to us about slowing down, about spending time at home, about playing board games, about hugging our family and being together, you know what? It's a good time to be doing that. And I, for one, are starting to enjoy that, and I hope you're doing the same.
Hi, Bridge Community Church from the Carlson household. We are doing great. Hopefully you guys are as well. Praying for everybody. Hopefully all this craziness ends soon, and we hopefully can see everybody soon. We love you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Okay, this is take 10. Hello, Bridge Church. This is John.
And Olita.
And we'd like to tell you that everything here at home is doing just fine. We miss you guys. And also we'd like to thank the staff for passing along information via YouTube and social media. Keep us informed as to what's going on there at church and with everyone else.
Remember, the joy of the Lord is our strength.
Happy birthday, Parker.
Love you.